April 6, 1943. Paris, France. In the dimly lit corner of a cramped café, Sonia sat, her fingers lightly drumming against the glass of water in front of her. She glanced over the rim of her cup, the steam rising gently from the drink, and observed the men at the bar. The murmur of German, the sharp bark of French, and the low cadence of Italian floated through the air like a web of languages, all wrapped in the thick, smoky haze of war. She was used to it now, the disorienting mix of tongues, the fractured reality of a world being torn apart by a war that knew no boundaries, no morals. Her lips were stained with a faint trace of red lipstick, but her eyes remained cold, calculating, hidden beneath a well-rehearsed mask of innocence. The city, occupied by the Nazis, had become a labyrinth of dangers and opportunities for people like her, outsiders with the audacity to resist, to disrupt. Sonia was no exception. She was a chameleon, a woman with no real nationality, no fixed identity. She was a spy, and in this world, being nothing was the greatest advantage one could have. She had learned long ago that the power of language was the most subtle form of control. Words could be weapons, shields, disguises. She was fluent in 5 languages: German, French, Italian, English, and Spanish. Each one a tool she had honed over years of necessity, each one a lifeline in the deadly game of espionage. But to Sonia, language was more than just communication. It was the key to unlocking the world around her, a means to slip through the cracks, to become invisible and indispensable. The Gestapo didn't know her name. They had many suspects, many spies to hunt. But Sonia was just one of many, a cipher in a vast, shadowy network of resistance. They would call her the translator, or simply the woman with the accent, but they didn't know who she really was, and she intended to keep it that way. She had arrived in Paris several months ago, a city teeming with Nazi officers, collaborationists, and resistance fighters. A perfect storm of espionage, a place where every corner held a potential threat or opportunity. She had carefully crafted her persona, a French-speaking, German-born woman with impeccable manners and an uncanny ability to blend in. It had taken months to win the trust of certain officers, to become their confidant, their eyes and ears within the ranks of the invaders. She played the part flawlessly, becoming indispensable in the Nazi command structure. She had no political loyalties, no allegiance to any flag. She only had her mission, to gather intelligence, to disrupt the enemy, to stay alive. The cafe door opened with a soft chime, and a man entered. His uniform was sharp, crisp, the eagle insignia of the Reich gleaming under the dim light. Sonia didn't flinch, didn't even look up. But she knew him. Major Klaus Richter, the man who had taken an interest in her a few weeks earlier, a man with a hunger for power and control. A man she could manipulate with a well-timed compliment, a carefully placed word. He was sitting at a table not far from hers now, speaking in low tones to another officer, his face hard, yet his eyes flickered with something else, something that Sonia recognized, the desire to dominate. Her fingers tightened around the glass, the ice clinking softly. He had no idea what she was capable of. None of them did, but she knew everything about them. The names of their wives, their children, their favorite drinks, the way they spoke when they were nervous, when they were angry, when they were drunk. She had studied them all. They were predictable in their flaws. They were human. Sonia had learned early on that fear was the key to understanding her enemies. Fear and greed. The Gestapo, these men who believed themselves infallible, were motivated by both. Fear of losing power, fear of the resistance, fear of a world slipping from their grasp, and greed, the thirst to control, to manipulate, to dictate the lives of those who lived under their shadow. But what they didn't know was that Sonia had learned how to exploit those same fears. She could make them believe anything. She could make them believe she was one of them, a loyal servant of the Reich. She could make them believe they held the power. Her mind was always moving, always calculating. Every conversation, every interaction was an opportunity to gather information, to plant seeds of doubt, to create confusion. She would feed the right people the right lies. all while protecting her true identity. She was always one step ahead, always watching, listening, learning. But there were cracks in the facade. Every day, she had to be more careful, more precise. The allies were closing in, and the network she had so carefully cultivated was starting to unravel. The Gestapo had grown more suspicious in recent weeks, and every whispered word, every misplaced glance could betray her. Sonia was no fool. She knew the cost of failure. But she also knew that failure was not an option. She had already seen the consequences of those who failed. The streets of Paris were littered with the bodies of spies, their names erased from history, their sacrifices forgotten. Sonia had made her choice long ago. She had chosen the path of resistance, the path of danger, the path that would demand everything of her. And though she was alone in this fight, she had one advantage. She was invisible. The enemy didn't see her. They never would. But there was a darkness in the city, a weight that pressed down on her every time she stepped into the light. The question, always the question, how long could she keep up the charade? How long could she keep speaking the languages of the enemy, the languages that were never truly hers? And then, as if the city itself had answered her unspoken thoughts, the door to the cafe swung open again. This time, the man who entered was not in uniform. He was a civilian, an unassuming figure, but Sonia knew him instantly. Her contact, the one who brought the messages, the codes, the intelligence that would decide the fate of thousands. Her heartbeat quickened as the man locked eyes with her across the room, a brief flicker of recognition. He slid into the seat opposite her without a word, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to fall away. This was the only moment that mattered. This brief exchange, this secret that passed between them. Sonia's hand reached into her purse and slipped out a folded note. As she passed it to him, their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt a jolt, a spark of something dangerous. But that was the life she had chosen. She had no room for hesitation, no room for fear. The note was simple, a message from her contact. The Führer has trusted a mole. The words burned in her mind, and her pulse quickened. She felt a strange satisfaction, but also a deep sense of dread. She wasn't just any spy. She was something far more dangerous. The question that lingered in her mind was this: who was the mole? And, more terrifyingly, was she the one who was being hunted? July 19th, 1944. Berlin, Germany. The war had reached its boiling point. The Allies were advancing from the west, pushing deeper into Nazi territory with every passing day, while the Eastern Front was crumbling under the weight of the Soviet push. Berlin was suffocating under the oppressive weight of its own ambition. The city a stark contrast of looming, brutalist architecture and the chaos of a collapsing empire. For Sonia, it was a city of contradictions, opportunity and peril, survival and inevitability. She had arrived here under the guise of a simple civilian contractor, sent to help with translation work for the German military. To most, she was just another face in a sea of officials, soldiers, and collaborators. But to the few who trusted her, she was invaluable. And, as always, invisible. She had been working for months in the heart of the Reich, mingling with officers, generals, and officials whose names were written in blood and fear. Her role as a translator had become a key function within the German military operations, an unsung, seemingly insignificant task that hid the secret of her true purpose. To them, she was just another translator tasked with bridging the gap between their military machine and the occupied territories. But to Sonia, every conversation, every fleeting glance was a potential source of critical information, a moment to listen, to learn, to manipulate. She had mastered the art of remaining unseen, even in plain sight. In the depths of the war machine, Sonia's fluency in 5 languages had become her weapon, sharper than any blade and deadlier than any bomb. She could speak fluent German, but she also spoke perfect French, English, Italian, and Spanish, each one a thread in the web she wove around her enemies. Each language offered her a different perspective, a different insight into the minds of those who thought themselves untouchable. She was often called upon to translate important documents, to interpret conversations between the Nazis and their allies, or to mediate tense discussions. In a war built on secrets, she was the keeper of some of the most dangerous ones. Sonia had already seen how those around her, men who wore uniforms and wielded authority, were crumbling under the weight of their own paranoia. The relentless pressure to maintain control, to hold the line, had broken many of them, their minds fractured and unstable. But for Sonia, the pressure was different. It was quiet. It was internal. She had learned to keep her emotions in check, to bury any signs of vulnerability deep beneath the layers of lies she had constructed. She had to remain calm. She had to stay focused. There was no room for mistakes, no margin for error. Every step she took was a tightrope walk over a pit of oblivion. One misstep, one slip of the tongue, and everything would unravel. The meetings she attended were often laced with tension, with Nazi officers barking orders, issuing threats, and sharing their delusions of victory. But Sonia knew better. She knew that their grip on power was slipping. The collapse was inevitable, and it was only a matter of time before the Allies would break through, before the Reich would fall. What kept her awake at night, however, wasn't just the fear of discovery. It was the knowledge that, in the end, she would be forgotten. History would remember the generals, the soldiers, the famous spies who had taken credit for the victories. But she would remain in the shadows, her role unacknowledged, her sacrifices erased. But that, she knew, was the price of survival. The first time Sonia had met Major Klaus Richter, she had sensed immediately that he was dangerous. He was not like the others. There was something calculating in the way he observed people, a hunger in his eyes that never quite disappeared. He had started showing an interest in her almost from the beginning. At first, it was harmless, casual conversations about the weather, the war, the state of the world. But soon, those conversations grew more personal. He began asking about her background, about her family, about the country she had lived in. Each question, each seemingly innocent inquiry, was an opportunity for Sonia to play the part, to feed him just enough of the truth to keep him satisfied. She was careful, always careful, to remain vague, to avoid anything that could expose her. The key was never to be too confident, never to give too much away. If she acted like she belonged, like she was just another cog in the machine, she could blend in, disappear. But Richter wasn't fooled so easily. Sonia could see it in his eyes. He was probing, testing her. He didn't trust her, but he was too cautious to confront her directly. Instead, he used his power subtly, in ways that kept her on edge. He would call on her at odd hours, requiring her to translate sensitive documents or to sit in on meetings that were technically beyond her role. He wanted to see how she reacted, to see if there were cracks in her facade. She learned quickly that Richter's interest in her wasn't just professional. It was personal, a dangerous game of cat and mouse. He was testing her loyalty, her patience, and her willingness to comply. The stakes were higher now. Sonia wasn't just translating orders. She was becoming part of the machinery, an insider in the heart of the Reich. One night, Richter summoned her to his office. The air was thick with the smell of cigarettes and whiskey, and the dim light of his desk lamp cast long shadows across the room. Sonia walked in, her heart beating a little faster than usual. He was seated behind his desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the surface. His eyes flickered up as she entered, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Fräulein Sonia," he said, his voice smooth, but with an edge to it. "I need you to do something for me." Sonia nodded, her expression neutral. She had learned long ago to mask any trace of emotion. She had learned that the key to surviving in this world was to never let them see fear, to never let them see how close to the edge you were. "I need you to translate a document," he continued, sliding a folder toward her. "But I also need you to attend a meeting with General Muller tomorrow. His concerns have grown, and he needs someone he can trust to relay information. You'll be there to interpret, but also to observe." Sonia's pulse quickened. This was different. This wasn't just translation. This was an opportunity to learn more, to understand more. But it was also a risk, a dangerous one. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady. "I'll be there." As she left his office that night, Sonia couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in around her. Richter's game was no longer about simple suspicion. It had become about control. He was playing with fire, and she knew that one wrong move would ignite everything. But she had no choice. She had to keep moving, keep adapting, keep surviving. The next day, she entered the room where the meeting would take place. General Mueller was there, flanked by his officers. She took her seat, feeling the weight of their eyes on her. She was just a translator, just a voice, but in that moment, she understood something. The game had changed, and she was about to become a much bigger player than she had ever intended. May 2nd, 1945. Berlin, Germany. The war had finally reached its end, but for Sonia, the culmination was not the liberation she had imagined. The streets of Berlin were littered with the debris of a city in collapse, the crumbling remnants of a regime that had once seemed invincible. The Reich was no more, but the ghosts of its machinery still lingered, filling the air with a kind of eerie finality. The Allies were pushing in from all sides, their tanks rolling down streets that had once been filled with Nazi banners and propaganda. The end was here, but Sonia felt no victory. Instead, she felt a deep, gnawing emptiness. For months now, she had watched as the Nazi officials and generals she had once worked with turned to shadows of themselves, desperate to avoid capture, to escape accountability. The Gestapo had disbanded in the chaos, leaving behind nothing but a trail of wreckage. But that trail, Sonia knew, was not just made of fallen soldiers and toppled statues. It was made of the countless secrets, the unacknowledged sacrifices, and the untold stories of those who had served in the shadows, just like her. The truth, however, was that Sonia's contribution to the war effort, her months of risky intelligence gathering, her ability to manipulate high-ranking officials, and her role in sabotaging key operations would never be fully known. She had played her part in the slow unraveling of the Third Reich, but in the aftermath, she was nothing more than a faceless figure in the background of history. The world, it seemed, had little room for heroes who worked in shadows. She had been forgotten. The war had wiped the slate clean for those in positions of power, for the generals who could claim their victories, for the officers who had faced down the enemy on the front lines. Their names would be etched into the stone of history, their faces immortalized in photographs, medals, and ceremonies. But Sonia, whose work had directly impacted the course of the war, was left without recognition. Her role had been essential. There were few who could have pulled off the feat she had. But now, with the war's conclusion, she was a ghost, a name that would fade into the annals of forgotten history. Her work had been meticulous, methodical. She had become indispensable to the Nazis in her role as a translator. But her true mission was far more dangerous. She had infiltrated the highest ranks of the military, using her linguistic skills to extract critical information, to sabotage plans, and to turn the tide in favor of the Allies. She had passed on secrets, disrupted operations, and ultimately played a role in the downfall of the Third Reich. But no one would know her name. No one would remember her face. She was not a spy who could be celebrated, not a soldier who could be paraded in front of cameras. She was an unseen hand, working in silence, and her work had been erased along with the regime she had helped to destroy. The last time Sonia had seen Major Klaus Richter was just before the collapse of Berlin. He had been desperate, frantic even, clinging to the hope that some fragment of the Reich could survive, that some semblance of order could be restored. He had sought her out one last time, though the meaning behind his words had been lost beneath the weight of the inevitable collapse. Fräulein Sonia, he had said, his voice strained, almost pleading. We are at the end, but you can still be a part of something bigger. Help me. Help us rebuild.